Okay, so I just mentioned that Swidler had those couple of criticisms of the whole values approach, and then she introduced this approach called the toolkit approach to culture. Now, let me say a little bit more before I explain that toolkit idea. Swidler, writing in mid-1980s, was trying to combat what had become really popular in policy circles, political policy circles, which is what's known as the culture of poverty argument. Now, this is still swirling out there, and it drives a lot of the way that politicians and a lot of kind of mainstream writers talk about poverty. Most sociologists are highly skeptical of this approach. Now, to break it down, basically what this said was that poverty causes people to have different values, and those different values recreate poverty. Now, if you think for just a second about that, you'll realize that it's kind of a goofy argument because it's a blame the victim argument. Because, well, it's like a mostly blame the victim argument, because it's basically saying, okay, well, there's been bad impoverished conditions, but at the end of the day, what's happened is that people who are poor end up developing different values, and they pass those on, and it's those values that cause poverty to keep happening through successive generations. In the middle of that argument is the big blame the poor person part. And what Swidler says is that, and what most sociologists would say in agreement with her, is that that's just hullabaloo. Poverty is mostly based on political decisions and economic policies. And furthermore, she says, if you actually survey poor people, you will find that, voila, most poor people, most middle class people, and most rich people in this thing we call the United States of America have pretty much the same values. They all pretty much value hard work at the same level. They all pretty much value trying to save at the same level. They all pretty much value the importance of freedom. They all pretty much value democracy. So, oops, excuse me there. My timer went off at the wrong moment. 1 second, please. They all pretty much value these things all at the same level. So if that's the case, values just don't work in the way that everybody says they do. So instead, she says, what she says values are good for is that values are good for talking about goals. So at one level, she's in agreement with somebody like Weber, who had this whole thing about the importance of the goal or the end. She says the problem with Weber and the problem with a lot of other people like Parsons and Schills and others was that values are not good for talking about the means. So talking about what people actually do. So the way things happen in life. And this connected to her demolishment of that culture of poverty argument, in which she said, look, if you actually spend some time with poor people, especially if you don't know poor people at all, which is a lot of people who talk about poor people either haven't been poor or don't know impoverished communities, she said, you'll find that they value the same things. But you'll find that a lot of the behaviors and things around work or schooling or family, why there are differences between different economic groups, has to do with the way that our situations constrain the means that we have to actually do something. So she says if you look quite closely, you'll find that one reason why it seems that some impoverished communities treat work differently or family differently is because the conditions they're in are drastically different. The economic and social conditions they're in are drastically different. There's unstable amounts of work that's available to them because of flight of factories from cities. There are poor schools available to them, so oftentimes education, and this is huge educational inequality because of the way the United States funds schools. It's based on local tax bases, and if there isn't much to tax, then you don't have much money and you can't provide much of a good school. And also, you have all sorts of, in impoverished communities, you will oftentimes kind of have high needs of mobility to try and get work. So people might have to migrate around to try and find work. So it's very kind of unstable ability to continue a lot of relationships in family life. So she says if you look closely, these people all value the same goals, but the means by which they live, so the means by which they try to fulfill any kind of abstract goals or values, are going to be drastically different amongst communities, different communities in different parts of the economic ladder. So she says, hey, you goofy sociologist, because of all this, you need to start thinking that instead of thinking about values as the way to understand the means or the way to understand most action in the social world, she says you should think of culture as a toolkit. In this case, most of us are walking around society, and inside of us we have different, what she calls, strategies of action to get through life. And we choose different strategies of action in different situations. So let me give you an example. Let me try and take these kind of abstract ideas and give you a really concrete example. Think for a second about love. Now, if you step back and you listen to the way your friends or your family or you maybe talk, you'll find that we actually have lots of different ways of talking about love and different ways of dealing with love. So we have different strategies of action. Let me give you some concrete example. You'll often see movies, blah, books, blah. I'm saying blah because I'm about to say these romantic ideas. It's more commentary than anything else. But as a sociologist, you'll see lots of messages about romantic, never-ending, perfect love. But then, if you follow and you talk to people, you talk to them about love in their lives, you'll oftentimes hear people talk about, well, there's also kind of realistic, pragmatic things about love. For example, people talk about, well, love ends, or sometimes love can't be perfect, or that love requires hard work. Well, that sure sounds a lot different than kind of romantic, idealistic, you don't have to work very hard, it's all about emotions and feelings message of love. And what Ann Swidler argues is that this suggests that we have different strategies of action for love, and that depending on different moments in our lives or different phases of a relationship, we'll reach into our toolkit where we have strategies of action for love, and we'll pull one out. And we do this somewhat consciously, somewhat unconsciously. And at that given moment, we'll kind of use a different way of thinking about or dealing with love to get through whatever's happening at that moment in our life. And she says this is particularly the case when we have institutions in our society that treat love in different ways. So for example, we have institutions like families who might encourage their kids to date a bunch when they're teenagers, to meet different people, and to be kind of pragmatic about love. But then we have this other institution called marriage, which in our society is you sign on the dotted line and the expectation is it's going to last forever. Okay, so we have this kind of important social institution called marriage that's particularly important for raising children and providing stability. And it's a lifelong expectation. But then we have this other social institution called divorce, which is a little bit more of kind of this pragmatic thing of like, well, look, some love ends or some relationship ends. And so you need to have a way to kind of officially make it end. And so people can kind of restart over again. And so what Swidler's saying is because we as a society have these different institutional ways of dealing with love, we as individuals have these different strategies of action about how to deal with love. And that as we bump into these different institutions at different parts of our lives, we reach into our toolkit and we do different things. What you should have figured out by now is that Ann Swidler really doesn't think values are worth much of anything in sociology, except for broad ways of talking about shared goals. So Swidler would say that we should really limit any role of values for explaining kind of individual social action or explaining action at different points in people's lives, because they can, over the course of their lives, people can always value love, but their actual repertoires, the means and how they actually do things in the course of their lives will differ quite a bit. So she would kind of say, let's set the whole values thing aside. So we've had 3 critiques here. We've had the critique I put out about shills, about some of the problems. We had C. Wright Mills' critique. And then we have Swidler's critique. They have some similarities, they have some differences, but overall they tell us a couple things. Let's be skeptical that values can explain everything. Let's be skeptical about the way a lot of society talks about values. Let's look much more closely at the situations where action happens. Let's be aware that a lot of action is patterned and reoccurring, giving money to a homeless person, saying hello to your boss. Let's be clear that we have different vocabularies for talking about why we do things, and the reasons that we say we do things are not necessarily the reasons why we actually did things. And then let's be clear too that a lot of our life is about trying to figure out different things to do in different situations. And a toolkit might be a better way to talk about the way culture works. And in this way, culture, in Swidler's example, isn't about values at all, but is about these kind of different strategies of action. So we've had a pretty big demolishing of the values approach to understanding culture. And we've even had an introduction of an idea, which you're going to actually see reoccur in some of our later readings of the course. Because in the 1980s, by 1986, values was gone from sociology, and this toolkit idea became one of the real most dominant ways to talk about culture. Now there's problems with that, and we're going to learn all sorts of ways of talking about culture, but a lot of those are sometimes informed by this toolkit idea, so I wanted you to introduce with it. Now I'm going to stop here. This is the end of 3/4 of the lecture, and then I'm going to spend the last quarter of the lecture and tell you, you know what, let's not totally get rid of values. Let's keep all those criticisms and problems in mind, but I think there's a couple things that values could still do for us as sociologists to understand culture. I'll be right back, and we'll finish the lecture with those.